Welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. Another great show in store for you. My guest, sitting next to me, Patricia Goldstone, who is a author of several books, but we're going to discuss this book, Interlock, Art, Conspiracy, and the Shadow Worlds of Mark Lombardi. And I fell in love with this book as soon as I heard about it because I didn't know about Mark Lombardi, but I knew about many, or I'd heard about or been involved in my work at Pacifica Radio with many of the conspiracies and the stories. Actually, you talk about the facts and things that we know that did happen that are covered in your book, and that this artist, Mark Lombardi, had known so much about it and had played such a role in exposing or bringing it to the public's eye. So thank you for joining us, Patricia.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Great to have you on. And this is your book, Interlock. And here we go. Nice. Art, Conspiracy, and the Shadow Worlds of Mark Lombardi. And I don't know, we can see the side of it as well. So let's begin. First of all, because folks are probably looking behind us and wondering what is this graph, this piece of art? I'm not sure what to call it. What would you call that?
Well, Mark is, I should explain that Mark was a conceptual artist, which essentially means he drew ideas as opposed to drawing water lilies. For example, and he's unique in the art world because he created his work out of interlocks, which are actually accounting tools that were once popular in antitrust litigation back in the days when we still busted trusts. What interlocks trace is overly cozy relationships between boards of directors. And Mark sort of extended the definition of corporation to include intelligence agencies, organized crime, banks, and governments to track flows of money, essentially. That's what these arcing lines that you see in the background are. These are money flows. They represent transactions. In social network analysis, they'd be called the who to whom. And this drawing is actually a drawing that he made towards the end of his life. This is the George Bush, Harkin Energy, Jackson Stevens piece, which he did in October of 1999, about 6 months before he died.
When did he die?
He died in March of 2000.
And how did he die?
Well,
that's an issue. Whenever somebody makes how somebody died an issue, then we start getting to interesting territory. How old was he when he died?
He was 49. He was found hanged in his studio in Williamsburg.
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. On the eve of what was to be a great success. His career was really taking off. Mark had worked for many years in total obscurity, and he achieved success quite late in life for an artist. He began to surface in 1997 when he was already well into his 40s and moved to New York at that time. And there's a lot of fog around his death. I actually began my research by finding the actual police reports.
That would be my next question. How did you come? We're going to talk more about what he specifically told us, or some of the things he told us that you cover in this book, but how did you come to want to write a story about Mark Lombardi? How did you hear about him? If he was not, did you know him before he became famous?
No, I never knew him personally, which is something I regret greatly. But I am a collector of oddities, and I keep an oddities file. And about a year after his death, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And, the journal does these cute little pencil sketches of its subjects. And right there on the front page in the left-hand non-dupe column, if I recall correctly, there was a portrait of Mark looking attractively demented as usual. He was very intense, and his eyes tended to bug out a bit, and he wore these big black-rimmed Roy Orbison glasses. So there's a portrait of this goofy-looking artist, and in the background, one of his drawings is raying out behind his head. And I looked at the drawing and I said, hey, that's an interlock.
Right.
And then I looked at the story, and nowhere did the Wall Street Journal, a business publication, mention the fact that here was an artist who created his work out of an accounting tool, which certainly if I had been writing this story would have been my lead. So I thought, how weird is this? And you know, then it just became a question that bugged me. Why was he creating art out of interlocks? So I clipped the story and I filed it away, and I forgot about it until 2007 when the financial tiles started coming off the roof. And then I just found myself thinking of him, and I had finished my second book. That was out, and I was looking for something to sink my teeth into, and ended up sinking my teeth into this.
First of all, tell me about yourself, Patricia Goldstone. You are a writer. You'd been published prior to this, and you're working on another book now. Tell us a little bit about your background. How who have you written for, and what are your previous books?
I will do that. This is my third book. I wrote my first book, Making the World Safe for Tourism, for Yale University Press, and that too evolved out of an oddity. Part of my job when I was a journalist, when I was working at the LA Times many years ago, was trend spotting. And round about 1995, I started noting a bulge in travel pieces about travel to places like Myanmar. And I thought, now who in their minds would want to vacation in Myanmar? Is this some daft economist's 5-year plan? And as it happened, it turned out that that was part of it. So that book was about how tourism became the world's biggest business.
I see. So it was being planned. Tourism was planned to certain locations around the world in order to create a market, and then.
And in the Middle East peace process, interestingly enough, because that's what my second book came out of, it was used as a soft power issue to draw people together. Water, which was considered really difficult to negotiate, was dropped off the table in Madrid in '92, and tourism was substituted, essentially.
Construction of hotels and things like that, right?
Yes, the hospitality business.
And that was your second book that led to?
My second book was, originally, I planned it to be a book about water and conflict in the Middle East, because I was going to go back to that issue. And it was going to be a rather wonky book, and I came across a footnote in a book by David Fromkin called Peace to End All Peace, and it was an extended footnote about a gentleman named Aaron Aronson, who in the years before, immediately before World War I, not II, World War I, did the first comprehensive water mapping of Syria and Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. And Aaron, as I began to delve into his background, was this really compelling figure who just took over the whole thing, because he was the Jewish T.E. Lawrence. He ran British intelligence in Palestine throughout the war, using his sister Sarah as his chief of operations.
And that book was published as well?
That book was published by Harcourt in 2007.
And folks can look up Patricia Goldstone and find these books on
they'll find these books, yes.
Amazon or wherever. Okay, the library even. All right, great. All right, so back to Mark Lombardi and the book we're discussing now, which is Interlock, Art, Conspiracy, and the Shadow Worlds of Mark Lombardi. Now, one of the interesting, there's a lot here. We're talking about Harkin behind us, but going back to the Clinton family, because you talk about Jackson Stevens, and who was Jackson Stevens?
Well, it's kind of hard to do this piecemeal. Jackson Stevens was a very wealthy Arkansas businessman, owner of, at the time, I think the 10th largest investment bank in the country. And shades of the election we just suffered through, Jackson Stevens bankrolled both the George H.W. Bush and the Clinton campaigns. And I think he also put money into George W. Bush's campaign, if I remember correctly.
So he's pretty much got
Yeah,
like a typical
he's an
financier.
across the aisles guy.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And he was an important financier in the early career of President Bill Clinton.
Yes.
He's from Arkansas as well.
Yes,
and Clinton
indeed.
was governor from Arkansas.
Of Arkansas, exactly.
Probably knew Hillary as well. But interestingly, do you cover in the book the Mena, Arkansas airport and
Barry Seal,
Barry Seal.
Very tangentially. This story is more dominant because Jackson Stevens and Alan Kasha, who's down in the lower left corner there, Alan Kasha is another very important figure in the Republican Party, also crossed over into Democratic Party politics, and he directed the investments of the Harvard Endowment. He is the owner of a financial company called Quadrant.
Wow.
But
Harvard's at the middle of everything that's important. I mean, it was James Conant of Harvard was behind the Manhattan Project. So if Harvard's involved, it's top level.
But Kasha and Jackson Stevens were involved in bailing out George W. Bush's failing oil company, Harkin.
Right, that was that company,
hence the title of this piece.
And the movie W, I remember, is that covered in Oliver Stone's movie W? I don't know if you ever saw that, but that is sort of a biopic on...
I didn't.
Right, interesting.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, it might be in there. But what I'm interested in is the brother Neil Bush and the fact that there was a savings and loan scandal in that same period.
Well, Mark actually did a drawing called Neil Bush Silverado.
Right.
It's a verso. So
what do you mean by verso?
It's a drawing with images on either side.
I see.
So on one side, I think, is Lincoln Savings, Charles Keating's bank, and then on the other side
Charles Keating, that's a blast from the past.
Yes, and on the other side is Neil Bush Silverado, Neil being one of the directors of Silverado, a savings and loan that failed spectacularly in the early 90s.
Right, it's spectacularly. It was part of a bubble that was blown sort of in the savings bank industry. And
what Mark did in his work, which is so remarkable, is that he showed how, and really not by using conspiracy techniques, but by very hard, rigorous research, and I'll explain his working methods in a moment. He showed how every financial bubble and scandal from, well, if we're going to be orthodox about it, from World War II onward to 2000 when he died, connects to one another through certain key players, through middlemen. And remember that the world he's referring to in his artwork is the shadow economy, the shadow banking economy.
You call it the shadow worlds, Mark Lombardi.
Yes, that was my publisher being poetic and taking license. What he did was to create what amounts to a continual visual history of the shadow banking business that we've heard so much about since 2008. You know, this offshore world where hot money just collects out of the sight of the tax collectors and the regulators and accumulates. So what he's graphing or mapping in his drawings is the movements of this hot money, which can be defined either as stolen money or laundered money, or the other financial definition of it is legitimate funds that flow from country to country in search of higher rates of return.
And don't necessarily come to the United States, so they can be taxed by the United States, although everybody involved is making money off the American market. So. And
what the drawings show, what they really bring home to you, particularly if you look at them for 3 years, as I did, is to show you how inextricably these two financial worlds are bound to one another, the shadow world with the legitimate economy.
Sort of like dark energy, dark matter. And, I don't know if people read about that, we won't go into it, but so there's a thing that goes hand in hand with our regular above board economy in which we all pay taxes and everything is taxed and everybody knows about it. Is it a bigger world, a smaller, an equal sized world of shadow or secretive
according to Hernando de Soto, who's quite a well-known economist and advisor to several governments, the shadow world has come to dwarf the world economy. He published some very startling statistics around 2009 about how derivatives represent a larger portion of the world's
derivatives.
Wealth than does actual world product.
That makes sense. If you know, and I suggest there's lots of books. The film The Big Short, which you can see on Netflix or on YouTube, whatever, is an excellent, I thought, introduction to this world.
Oh yes, very good film.
And learning exactly what derivatives are, is people betting on people betting people on. So the initial bet, which is all stock market activities or bets basically on the house, you can actually bet on the outcome of the bets. Will you win the bet? I'll bet 2-1. You can win the bet. Well, will he win the bet? I'll bet 3-1 that he'll win the bet. So next thing you know, one bet has now extends out to like maybe thousands.
Well, the important thing to remember about derivatives is that there's nominal price and real price, and derivatives tend to be valued in terms of this kind of speculative price, what it will be worth at the end of the contract, as opposed to what it's really worth at a particular moment in time, and derivatives bets can go spectacularly bad.
Right. I know. Well, as we know, we've all lived through it.
As we know, yes.
Right, and so it's a very well. Everybody's trying to make a buck.
Well, yeah, but then again, to return to Mark's work, to the drawings themselves, it's very interesting that the point in his chronology. Oh, and this, how do I explain this? Okay, so Mark's drawings are recursive. They're what people in the computer science.
Like they pass through nodes.
Well, it's not just that. They all connect to one another. They form a continual what Mark called the one big drawing in my head. They all connect to if he had ever put them in a room, they would have made a 360-degree panorama.
A couple of questions. So Mark was not a trained journalist or investigator. He wasn't an economist. He didn't go to Wharton School.
He was a working-class Italian-American guy from Syracuse who had nothing more than a bachelor's in fine arts. And
how did he wind up in Williamsburg?
Well, we have to take a detour here.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. So he went to Syracuse University, which had a very good art department. And the head of the art department was this very charismatic figure named James Harithus, who is a real stormy petrel in the art world. He's a museum director who kind of builds successes out of outraging his boards of directors, having very controversial exhibits. When Mark was an undergraduate, Jim had him curate a show called From Teapot Dome to Watergate, which related the Nixon scandals to the Warren Harding scandals, which were, of course, oil scandals in their origin. And Jim moved to Houston to become the director of the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston. And he tapped Mark to go down with him at age 23, 24 to become his curator, which was a huge, huge job for such a young man to have.
Sure.
And they had a falling out, which is rather a dramatic story that's in the book, but it resulted in Mark's being fired and going off on his own to start his research. And he had a vendetta against the Bushes because they were part of the reason that he was fired. So he started looking into the family's financial dealings down in Houston. And his skills as a researcher became widely known in Houston art circles, which surprisingly tend to the left. The de Menils were progressive with large quotes. The de Menil fortune, of course, comes from Schlumberger.
Right. There's a Pacifica station in Houston, so I'm familiar with it.
Yes. But Mark, and this is something that nobody knew, and that I only discovered halfway through writing the book, is I had a gut feeling that Mark could not have stayed underground as long as he did. It took 10 years to produce his initial body of work, 10 years of complete obscurity to produce his first series of paintings.
In the library?
He worked a lot in the Houston Public Library, but, and you know, he and his dealers always swore up and down on a stack of Bibles that he only got information from previously published sources, because people would ask him, you know, aren't you afraid of being knocked on the back of the head some night, given what you're going after?
We're getting to the fact that he died under mysterious circumstances in 2000 after producing these works of art. That were a sample of which about the Bush administration, well, the family of George Bush and their involvement with Harkin Energy, which was a George W. Bush's company which went bankrupt.
Yes, but there are a lot of other figures involved in his drawings.
Okay, go ahead. Finish what you were saying, though.
So Mark, at some point in the mid-'80s, was hired to do his research by a very, very important Texas politician, a woman, actually, named Sissy Farenthold, who was the first woman, I believe, to run for Vice President of the United States, 1972. And Sissy Farenthold was something of a crusader, and she wanted someone to really look into the connections between the Texas subprime crisis, which was ruining the state economy at that time, and the oil bubble.
Subprime means loans that are subprime, right? That are junk, garbage.
Yeah, and what had happened in Texas was that a lot of money went from speculative real estate into drilling dry oil wells and then back again, and it was, you know, it was Ponzi'd until the whole house of cards fell apart.
Pyramid scam.
Yep, exactly.
Everybody on the bottom gets screwed.
Exactly.
Wow.
So
this goes on in Texas?
No.
And the Bush family, the two presidents of the United States?
So Mark had quite an extended relationship with Farenthold, who introduced him to Alexander Cockburn, very well-known journalist, and also to a circle of people who were sort of fighting out their own battles with the Bush Empire in the courts. She introduced him to a very interesting man named Bill White, who figures in, very briefly, in the first couple of scenes of Robert Redford's Truth, which is about, if you recall, it's about how Dan Rather lost his job at CBS by investigating a story on George W. Bush's National Guard service.
Right, and there's other stories. There was the J.R. Hatfield, right? J.H. or J.R. Hatfield. He had written a book in which he claimed that there was a cover-up of a cocaine arrest of George W. Bush, and he wound up, he died. And some said mysterious circumstances.
Yes, but you have to remember that Mark was pretty equal opportunity in his finger pointing. I mean, he nailed the Clintons on...
he wasn't either. He sounds like an anarchist, left-wing journalist
You
guy?
know, I think he might...
Yeah, artist.
He was an SDS member when he was an undergraduate. But I think as he went along in this project, he really became more concerned with drawing what amounts to a financial system of systems. So
of this hidden money.
Yes, which reaches across the aisle.
Right. And what is this money? I mean, during Iran-Contra, and you mentioned Iran-Contra in your book, Patricia Goldstone, Interlock, a art conspiracy and the shadow worlds of Mark Lombardi. And there's so much we're not going to be able to touch on in this half hour, so obviously the book would be a place to look. And Iran-Contra, and I think we mentioned BCCI. That was a whole, there was the Promise software scandal where the software was stolen. Danny Castellaro's The Octopus I wrote about, and I know the family. And, you know, because I worked at Pacifica Radio, we were involved in uncovering a lot of this. Andrew, the Cockburns were all the Cockburns were guests on our shows. I remember as an engineer there and reporter. So I remember we covered a lot of these and touched on a lot of these. So it's great that we're talking about it because it brings back those days. Why is it, I think it is, why, in your opinion, is what Mark Lombardi did relevant to today?
Well, I think the money reaching across the aisle is highly relevant, especially in this last election, you know, where we had two candidates who had very serious questions being asked about their financial backgrounds.
Anything about Trump in your book?
Not in this one. But I think it's important for many reasons. And I have to say up front that I tend to bridle a bit when he's described as a conspiracy theorist because
Mark.
Yes, because his work was really very rigorous. When I interviewed Leonard Gumport, you know, he asked me,
his attorney,
this attorney who deposed Adnan Khashoggi and taught Mark how to do interlocks. He asked me whether I haven't explained the way Mark worked. Okay, so Mark would read hundreds of books, previously published books, yes, with one very important exception, about financial bubbles, scandals, general financial information. He would boil them down into bullet points of information on 3x5 index cards, file cards, which he would annotate with page references, titles, authors, dates. And when he started to draw, he would sit down on the floor of his studio because his drawings were too big to put up on the wall. And he would start arranging these cards in patterns and connecting them along. You see the horizontal lines?
Sure.
Those are timelines, beginning, middle, end.
Okay.
So each drawing has a finite time scale.
Sure.
And then hooks on to another drawing.
Right.
Okay, so according to Leonard Gumport, those file cards would be useful in a deposition because they were done according to academic standards.
Where are they now?
They, well, 14,000 of them are warehoused at MoMA's facility in Long Island City.
Museum of Modern Art?
Yes.
In New York, in Long Island?
Yes.
Okay.
I was originally told that there were 40,000, 40, not 14, of these file cards. I read through each and every one of them over at MoMA, and I was amazed to see that, we're getting back to the Bushes again, that all but 4 of the cards relating to the Bushes, who formed a major subject of Mark's research, were missing. And,
Okay.
and the museum could not explain that to me.
Oh, where can you see his art?
It is archived at both the Museum of Modern Art, which owns a large holding, I think 13 drawings, and also at the Whitney.
Are they going to have any shows on it?
Well, they are kept for the most part in storage. I am told because they are works on paper, and works on paper are fragile.
Okay, but you don't know if there's going to be a showing. All right, great. So thank you, Patricia Goldstone, author of Interlock. If you want to know more, you got to get the book. There's just too much to talk about here in one measly little 28-minute show. Maybe we'll get you on WBAI sometime, and we'll talk for 3 hours and take calls. Thank you very much, Patricia Goldstone.
Thank you, Paul.